Part 1, Chapter 2 of Family Happiness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Family Happiness by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. Part 1, Chapter 2. Spring had now come. My former depression was gone, and its place was occupied by the dreamy melancholy of springtime, and by vague hopes and desires. Though I lived in a healthier way than at the beginning of the winter, and occupied myself with my sister Sonia, and music and reading, still I used often to go into the garden and wander long, up and down the paths, or sit on the bench, my mind filled with all sorts of thoughts, hopes, and desires. Sometimes, especially when there was a moon, I would sit at the window of my room all night long, and when morning came I would throw on a single garment and often go, without waking Katya, down into the garden and across the dewy grass to the pond. Once I even went out into the field, and, alone and in the night, I made the entire circuit of the garden. Now it is hard for me to recall and understand the illusions which at that time filled my imagination. Even when I succeed, I can scarcely believe that my dreams were made of such stuff. They were so strange and remote from the reality. Toward the end of May, Sergyei Mikhailitch returned, as he had promised. His first call was toward evening, and he took us entirely by surprise. We were sitting on the terrace and preparing to drink tea. The garden was already clothed in green, and the nightingale made their haunt in every thicket on our place. The tufted branches of the lilac bushes were everywhere covered with white and purple, with a hint of flowers on the point of bursting into bloom. The foliage of the linden alley was translucent in the setting sun. A fresh, cool shadow lay across the terrace. The grass was already wet with the heavy fall of evening dew. In the backyard of the garden were heard the last sounds of day, the bustle of the cattle driven in from pasture. The simple-minded Nikan crossed in front of the terrace along the little path with his watering pot, and the cooling stream from the nozzle soon began to make the broken soil dark around the stems of the dahlias and the supports. Near us on the terrace, on a white cloth, stood the brightly polished samovar, bubbling and boiling, together with cream, buns, and cold meat. Katya, with her plump hands, was dipping the teacups like a careful housewife. I could not wait for my tea, for I was hungry after my bath and was eating a piece of bread, spread with thick, fresh cream. I had on a gingham blouse with flowing sleeves, and my wet hair was covered with a handkerchief. Katya was the first to see him through the window. "Ah, Sergyei Mikhailitch, we were only just talking about you." I jumped up and was going to run upstairs in order to change my dress, but he met me just as I was at the door. "Now what is the use of ceremony in the country?" said he, glancing with a smile at my head and the handkerchief. "You see, you are not ashamed to wear it before Grigori, and I am no more than Grigori." But at that very instant it seemed to me that he looked at me in a way that Grigori would never have thought of doing, and I felt ill at ease. "I'll be right back," said I, hastening to draw away from him. "What's the harm as you are?" he cried after me. "You are quite like a young peasant girl." How strangely he looked at me, said I to myself, as I hurriedly dressed myself upstairs. Well, thank God he's come. Now it will be more lively. After a hasty glance at the mirror, I gaily ran downstairs, and, without disguising the fact that I had hurried, I went on to the terrace all out of breath. He was sitting at the table and telling Katya about our affairs. When he saw me, he smiled and went on talking. According to him, our affairs were in a satisfactory condition. It was necessary for us merely to spend the summer in the country, and then we could go for Sonia's education either to Petersburg or abroad. "Well, now, if you could only be with us while we were abroad," said Katya. "But if we must be by ourselves, it would be worse than being in the woods." "Oh, how glad I should be to go around the world with you," he said, half serious, half in jest. "All right," said I, "let us go round the world." He smiled and shook his head. "But how about my mother and my affairs?" said he. "Well, as that is out of the question, now tell me, please, how have you been spending your time? Have you been blue any more?" When I told him that since he had been gone I had done this and that, and had not been troubled with depression, and when Katya corroborated my words, he praised me, and both his words and his looks were flattering as though I were a child, and he had the right to patronize me. It seemed to me necessary to give him a faithful and circumstantial account of all that I had done in the right direction, and to confess, as though before a priest, all that he might not approve. The evening was so warm and pleasant that, after the tea things had been carried away, we still sat on the terrace, and the conversation was so full of meaning for me that I did not notice how, little by little, the sounds of the people about us had died away. From all sides arose more fragrantly the perfumes of the flowers. The abundant dew was falling on the sward, The nightingale, trilling in the bushes near us, hushed his song when he heard our voices. The starry sky seemed to bend down nearer to us. It was only when a bat noiselessly flitted under the awning over the terrace, and fluttered about my white shawl, that I suddenly noticed that it was already dark. I huddled close to the wall and was opening my mouth to scream, but the bat, the same swift, noiseless flight, darted out from under the awning and disappeared in the darkness of the garden. "How I like your Pokrovskaya," said he, making a sudden change in the conversation. "I should like to spend my whole life sitting here on this terrace." "Well then, why not sit here?" suggested Katya. "That is very well," he went on, "but life does not sit still." "Why don't you get married?" asked Katya. "You would make anyone a splendid husband." "Why, because I like a quiet life, think you?" and he laughed. "No, Katerina Karilovna, there's no hope for you and me. Long ago all my friends ceased to regard me as a marrying man, and all the more for this reason I have come to the conclusion that it is best this way. That's a fact." It seemed to me that he said that with a sort of affected gaiety in his manner. "Indeed, that's good. You've lived all of 36 years and are tired of life," said Katya. "Ah, but how much I have gone through," he continued. "My only wish is to live a quiet life. But to get married, something else is necessary. Ask her," he went on to say, pointing to me. "It is for such girls as she to get married, and you and I will look on and rejoice in their happiness." There was an undertone of sadness in his voice, and an intensity which did not escape my attention. He was silent for a little while, and neither Katya nor I said a word. "Now, just conceive of such a thing," he went on, turning around on his chair. "Supposing I should suddenly, by some unfortunate chance, marry some maiden of 17, such a girl as Marya Alexandrovna. That's an admirable illustration. I'm very glad that I found such a happy one." I laughed and could not see any reason for his gladness at such an illustration, or where its application lay. "Now," said he, addressing me in a bantering tone, "tell me honestly, your hand on your heart, would it not be a trial for you to marry an old man who has lived out all his days, whose only desire is a quiet life, while life and movement are what you want?" I felt awkward and made no answer, not knowing what to say. "Now, see here, this must not be taken as an offer," said he, smiling, "but truly tell me, is it of such a husband that you dream when you wander about the garden paths afternoons? Or would you be unhappy with such a one?" "No, not unhappy," I began. "Nor yet contented," said he, taking the words out of my mouth. "Yes, but you see, I may be but again he interrupted me. "Well, now you see she is perfectly right, and I am so grateful to her for her frankness, and glad that we could have had this talk. Now, as far as I am concerned, such a marriage would be the greatest unhappiness," he added. "What a queer man you are! You haven't changed in the least," said Katya, as she went in from the terrace to order the supper. After she left us we sat in silence. Around us not a sound was heard, except that the nightingale, not now in fitful snatches as his habit is earlier in the afternoon, but with deliberate calmness, since now it was already night, poured out his plaint all over the garden, and another down in the ravine below, for the first time this spring, replied to him from afar. The one nearest to us seemed to be listening for a moment, and still clearer and more intensely rang out the liquid harmonious trill, and with sovereign calmness their songs resounded in this world of night, so peculiarly their own, so strange to us. The gardener went to the greenhouse to sleep, the sound of his heavy boots growing fainter and fainter along the paths. Someone gave a shrill whistle twice, at the foot of the hill, and then there was silence again. The foliage scarcely rustled, the canvas awning over the terrace stirred a little, and a delicious fragrance was wafted across the terrace. It seemed to me awkward to sit in silence after what had been said, but I now was at a loss for something to say. I looked at him. His eyes gleaming in the darkness were fixed upon me. "It is good to be alive in the world," said he. For some reason I sighed. "What is it?" "Yes, indeed, it is good to be alive in the world," said I, echoing his words. Again we relapsed into silence, and again I felt a sense of constraint. It occurred to me that I had offended him by agreeing with him that he was an old man, and I was anxious to soothe him, but I did not know how to do so. "Well, good-bye," he said, getting up. "Mother is expecting me home to supper. I've scarcely seen her today." "But I wanted to play my new sonata to you," said I. "Some other time," said he, coolly, as it seemed to me. "Good-bye." It now more than ever seemed to me that I had offended him, and I felt sorry. Katya and I escorted him to the porch, and we stood in the yard, looking down the road, where he was soon lost to sight. As soon as the sound of his horse's feet died away, I went around the garden and began once more to gaze down into the garden, and, in the dewy darkness, which muffled the sounds of night, long I saw and heard all that fancy made me see and hear. He came a second and a third time, and the constraint arising from our strange conversation entirely wore away, and did not return. As the summer went on, he rode over to see us 2 or 3 times a week, and I became so accustomed to his visits that when any unusual length of time elapsed without our seeing him, I became lonesome, and was vexed with him for treating me so unfairly. He behaved toward me as toward a dear young comrade, asked me questions, encouraged the most cordial frankness, gave me advice, stimulated me, sometimes scolded me and checked me. But in spite of all his endeavour to keep himself down on a level with me, I was conscious that, back of what was manifest to me in him, there lay a whole world into which he felt necessary to admit me, and it was this which had the greatest influence upon my imagination and attracted me to him. I understood from Katya and our neighbours that, over and above his care for his aged mother, with whom he lived, over and above his responsibilities as a landed proprietor and as our guardian, he had to exercise certain functions connected with the nobility which were most distasteful to him. But how he looked upon all this, and what his plans, convictions, and hope were, I never could get the slightest intimation from him. As soon as I led the conversation round to his own affairs, he frowned in his characteristic manner as much to say, "Please, I beg of you, this does not concern you," and brought up some other topic of conversation. At first this offended me, but afterwards I became so accustomed to talking about matters concerning myself alone that it seemed quite natural. Another thing that used at first to displease me, but afterwards came to be even pleasant, was his perfect indifference and apparent contempt for my personal appearance. Never by a look or a word did he hint that I was pretty, but on the contrary he frowned or smiled when I was called pretty in his presence. He even took pains to pick out my defects and banter me on the subject of them. The fashionable dresses and the way in which Katya liked to do up my hair for festive occasions aroused merely his sarcastic comments, which hurt the good Katya's feelings, and at first disconcerted me. Katya, who was convinced in her own mind that I pleased him, could not understand at all why he did not like the woman who pleased him to appear in the most attractive light. But I quickly came to see what he wanted. He was anxious to feel assured that I was free from coquetry. And when I understood that, then I made it evident that there was not a shadow of coquetry about me, in my dress or my hair or my actions. But this very thing showed like an embroidery in white worsted, that I had the coquetry of artless simplicity at a time when as yet artlessness was not natural to me. I was aware that he loved me, but whether as a child or a woman I did not ask myself. I prized his love and, being conscious that he considered me the very best girl in the world, I could not help hoping that he might still persist in this illusion, and I involuntarily helped to deceive him. But the very act of deceiving him in this way made me better. I felt how much wiser and nobler it was for me to show the better side of my soul than of my body. My hair, my hands, my face, my manners, whatever they were, good or bad, it seemed to me he understood and appreciated at a glance, so I could not add anything to my battery of attractions even if I desired to deceive. But my soul he did not know, because he loved it, and because it was all the time expanding and developing, and thus it was that I could and did deceive him. And how easy it was to manage him when I clearly understood this. The causeless disturbances which had troubled me before, especially the sense of awkwardness, entirely disappeared. I had the consciousness that, no matter how he saw me, whether from front face or in profile, whether sitting or standing, whether my hair was up or down, he knew me thoroughly, and, as it seemed to me, was satisfied with me as I was. I am certain that if, contrary to his habit, he had followed the example of others and told me that I was pretty, I should not have been in the least delighted. But on the other hand, how happy and light-hearted I was when, after some insignificant remark of mine, he looked steadily at me and said, in a voice that trembled a little, in spite of his attempt to impart a bantering tone, "Yes, yes, there is something in you. You are a splendid girl, I must tell you so." And why was it then that I received a reward such as filled my heart with pride and joy? Because I said that I appreciated the love of old Grigori for his little granddaughter? Or because I was moved to tears by reading some poetry or novel? Or because I preferred Mozart to Schulhoff? And the preternatural keenness of intuition, by which at that time I selected what was good and worthy of admiration, struck me as marvellous, and yet assuredly I was perfectly ignorant of such things. The most of my former habits and tastes did not please him, and a slight raising of his brow or a quick glance was all that was needed to show that he did not like what it was on my tongue to say, and his peculiarly woebegone and almost scornful expression made me feel that I detested what I had loved before. A hint was sufficient to give me a presentiment of what he was going to say to me. He would ask me a question and look into my eyes, and that look of his sufficed to draw from me the thought which he was after. All my thoughts and feelings at that time were his, not mine, but by becoming mine, they went to make up my life and fill it with light. Absolutely, without being myself conscious of it, I began to look at all things with different eyes, at Katya and at our domestics and at Sonia, and at myself and at my occupations. The books which I had formerly read, simply for the sake of killing time, suddenly became for me one of the greatest pleasures in my life, and the reason of it was simply this, that he and I talked about them or read them together. He kept me well supplied with books. Formerly, the time that I spent in superintending Sonia's lessons was burdensome, and I undertook it only from the compulsory feeling that it was my duty. He interested himself in her lessons, and it became a pleasure to me to see what progress and success the child made. Hitherto it had seemed an impossibility for me to learn a whole piece of music by heart, but now, knowing that he would listen to it and perhaps commend me for it, I would practice over a single passage 40 times, so that poor Katya stopped up her ears with cotton, but I found it not in the least tedious. The old sonatas, somehow or other, seemed to phrase themselves in an entirely different manner, and produced a different and vastly better effect. Even Katya, whom I knew and loved as myself, underwent a change in my eyes. For the first time I understood that she was under no obligation to be our mother, our friend, our servant, such as she had been. I appreciated all the dear soul's self-renunciation and devotion, appreciated all that I owed to her, and loved her more than ever before. He taught me to look on all of our dependents, peasants, domestics, maidservants, in an entirely different way from before. I am ashamed to confess that I had lived among these people for 17 years and knew less about them than about the people whom I had never seen. It had never once occurred to me that these men and women had the same affections, desires, and sorrows as my own. Our garden, our groves, our fields, which I had known so long, suddenly acquired a new beauty in my eyes. Nor vainly spoken was his remark that there is only one enduring happiness in life, to live for others. It seemed to me strange at the time. I did not understand it, but this conviction had unconsciously penetrated into my heart. He opened up for me a whole life of joy in the present, not making any apparent change in my life, adding nothing except himself to every impression. Everything which, since childhood, had been inert around me had suddenly become endowed with life. He had only to make his appearance for everything to break into speech, and, at the same time, for all the powers of my soul to spring into life, filling with joy. Often I would go upstairs to my room, fling myself on my bed, and give myself up to the sway, not of melancholy longings, hopes, and desires with which spring endowed the future, but of present happiness. I could not sleep, but I would get up, go over to Katya's bed, and confide to her sympathetic ears the story of my perfect happiness. Now, as I look back on it, I can see no reason for telling her. She could see it with her own eyes. But she told me that she needed nothing and that she was also very happy, and gave me a kiss. I believed her, for it seemed to me right and proper for everybody to be happy. But Katya was not superior to thoughts of sleep, and she used to become right stern and drive me off from her bed, and go to sleep, but I would still remain awake reviewing all my reasons for happiness. Sometimes I got up and said my prayers for a second time, thanking God in my own words for the happiness which he had vouchsafed me. And in my room it was still. The only sound was Katya's deep, regular breathing, the clock ticking by her side, and my restless turning and murmuring broken words, or crossing myself and kissing the crucifix on my neck. The doors were closed, the shutters drawn, a fly or mosquito was buzzing in some spot, and I felt as if I should always like to stay in my little room, to have the morning forever delay her coming, to retain forever about me my present spiritual atmosphere. It seemed to me that my dreams, my thoughts, and my prayers were living creatures, abiding there with me in the darkness, flying about my bed, hovering over me, and every thought was his thought, every feeling his feeling, and at that time I did not as yet know that this was love. I thought that this state of feeling might exist forever, that this feeling might always be unreciprocated. End of Part 1, Chapter 2.